Good evening. I'm Beth Bowles, and on behalf of my colleagues, Morgan Ritchie-Baum and Glenn Perkins, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our program, Exclusion by Design, From Redlining to Gentrification, hosted by the Greensboro Public Library in partnership with the Greensboro Historical Museum. Before we get into our program, I'll give you a few technical notes. We are using Zoom's webinar feature tonight, which means you will not be able to unmute your microphone or turn on your camera. This program is being recorded and shared on our social media channels, but only panelists and hosts will be visible to the public. After the presentation, our panelists will answer questions from the audience as time allows. If you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge our city dignitaries and members of our business and nonprofit communities. We appreciate your support in joining us for this important conversation. And one last note before I introduce our moderator. I'd like to share the impetus behind putting this program together. Up until a few years ago, I had never heard the term redlining. Then in 2018, I learned about it when I participated in the Greensboro Chamber of Commerce's Other Voices program, whose founder, Chuck Byrd, is joining our panel tonight. I was shocked to learn how redlining and other systemic barriers to home ownership greatly impacted African-American families' access to quality education and healthcare, and also impeded their ability to build generational wealth. But after I had time to reflect on what I had learned, I think I was more shocked by the fact that I had never heard about any of this. And I figured if I hadn't heard about it, there must be others who hadn't heard about it either. So that's why we wanted to bring people together. And whether you're hearing about redlining and its legacies for the first time, or you're interested in learning more about its impact in Greensboro, we appreciate you joining us tonight. And with that, I will welcome our moderator, Stan Wilson. Stan has served as the director of the City of Greensboro's Neighborhood Development Department since 2017. Stan has worked in county and community agencies in both North and South Carolina, and he was the housing director for the City of Charlotte for 12 years. Stan also serves on many boards and coalitions, and he volunteers as a youth mentor for African American male initiatives. Stan, we thank you for being with us tonight to facilitate this important discussion.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And once again, I'd like to welcome everybody and say good afternoon. So let's begin with our expert panelists. Dr. Stephen Sills is the director of the Center for Housing and Community Studies. He is a community engaged scholar and professor of sociology at UNCG. His early work focused on global migration, immigrant access to health and social services, and social support networks for marginalized people, working often in Southeast Asia. For the last 15 years, Dr. Sills has conducted housing research in North Carolina, focusing on inequitable access to safe, fair, healthy, and affordable housing. Now that we have an idea of what redlining is, we have Dr. Sills from UNCG to localize redlining here in Greensboro. Dr. Sills.
Thank you very much, Stan. Just like what we were hearing about in the NPR piece on Baltimore, we're going to see in about 8 minutes, 200 years of history of Greensboro, and many of those same issues here in our own community. Greensboro was chartered by the state of North Carolina in 1808 in the geographic center of the county. Unfortunately, that was a swamp where Irving Park is located today. So they moved up the hill just south and bought 42 acres from Ralph Gorell. If you've ever been to Dame's Chicken and Waffles, Gorell Street, named for this area, is right behind there. 44 building lots were sold. A public auction was made to raise funds for a courthouse and jail, and the tiny village of Greensboro was formed. The parallel history that is occurring at this time is that there were several other villages in the area, kind of patchwork quilt style across the geography of Guilford County. Greensboro as a village grew into a town by the mid-1800s with a railroad that cut east-west and north-south. Today, if you go downtown, you can see these tracks still around the area of South Elm Street. By the mid-1800s, it was a center of commerce, 16 factories and more than 60 trains a day cutting through. During the Reconstruction era, we also see that this patchwork quilt of other villages included African-American communities like Warnersville, 36 acres that were purchased by a Quaker community out of the Philadelphia area to settle Black families, 600 people in all, owning homes, building a community in this neighborhood that no longer exists today. The name Warnersville is still there, the Union Cemetery is still there, but none of the community exists. Other neighborhoods were developed very intentionally around the turn of the 1900s. Scott Park, for example, was platted in 1905 to be a community of working class African Americans. Noco Park, also in East Greensboro, in the 1920s, provided middle class and upper middle class homes to African Americans. It included a 12-acre park and an African American only hospital. Around the 1930s, as we saw in the documentary, the Homeowners Loan Corporation set out areas that were considered declining and hazardous for investment. These were the same communities of Warnersville, Noco Park, Jonesboro that were developing in the 1850s alongside white communities. But in the early 1900s, we saw a sorting effect occurring in Greensboro, with whites moving north and northwest and African Americans moving to the east side. These areas are now declining from the 1930s onward as a result of the denial of capital and the lowering in home values in this area. In the 1950s, we saw urban renewal, the placement of highways and thoroughfares, the destruction of business districts that were thriving African-American commercial areas, the erasure of one community completely, Jonesboro, in the path of US 29. Public housing was located in these neighborhoods, 400 units or more that would eventually decline the housing values and erode the community further. In 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was passed, 66% of white families in Greensboro and 41% of Black families were homeowners. Today, we see that white families are still near the same, 63%, but Black home ownership has dropped to 27.6%. This is Greensboro today, the map on the left showing African-American communities at the block group level. We see that some neighborhoods are 80, 90, and 95% people of color, while other neighborhoods on the northwest side of town are less than 15% communities of color. This tracks as well with poverty, where we see neighborhoods in East Greensboro, the neighborhoods of Warnersville, Noco Park, Smith Park, and others are 35, 45, and even 50% households in poverty. This has had a depressing effect on the housing markets, this map showing extremely weak markets in the east side of town. It's turned neighborhoods that were once owner-occupied housing into renter-occupied housing. It places at risk neighborhoods for gentrification, areas of rapid change and affluence because of weakened property values. These maps by 3 different studies show the same areas that were redlined in the 1930s are now at risk of gentrification, and some actually occurring already. These same communities also have health impacts. We see Cone Health data here. Respiratory illnesses that were related to environmental conditions like mold, mildew, pests in the homes are exacerbated and people end up in the hospital as a result. Communities in East Greensboro at higher risk of COVID. We see that Greensboro's COVID risk index is a 6, just slightly above that of the US. But areas of East Greensboro are a 10, as high as it can go on this scale. Finally, the impact on communities is overall life expectancy differences of about 20 years between neighborhoods in East Greensboro and North and Northwest Greensboro. We've related this information back to redlining. This map shows from the University of Richmond the red line map overlay on the city of Greensboro. And they've done this for city after city across the United States, tracking what were HOLC grades of green to red on the left bar, and matching them against today's CDC Social Vulnerability Index that takes into consideration poverty, infant mortality, obesity, diabetes, and other health issues. And we see that there's almost a one-to-one track between yellow and red areas of the 1930s and today's social vulnerability shown in red on the right-hand side. Stan?
Stephen, thank you for giving us that context of what's happening here in Greensboro. Our next panelist, Mr. Chuck Byrd, is a community change agent and founder of the Greensboro Chamber of Commerce Other Voices program, in which he is still an active in a leadership role. He's also making an impact by serving on the Greensboro Business League, the Ad Hoc Committee of African American Disparities, the Pulpit Forum, and the Council of Elders. Mr. Byrd lived in Greensboro in the 1960s and experienced blockbusting, a phenomenon that grew out of the segregated neighborhoods caused by redlining. Mr. Byrd, can you share your experiences with us?
Yes, thank you, Stan, and I'm glad to be here. And although I can't see you, I want to give a shout out to all my Other Voices alumni that I know are participating tonight in the audience. So my father was career military, and we were living in France in 1966. And my father got a notice that he had 30 days to move his family from France to the United States and report to Vietnam for a 13-month tour. Needless to say, that created issues and much haste and need in our family. My mother was from Mount Gilead, North Carolina, and my father and mother had met at North Carolina A&T State University. And so we came back, there were 3 children, to Mount Gilead, North Carolina to finish the school year while my parents went to Greensboro to look for a house to either rent or buy, whatever they could do in 30 days. During that time, the first place that they were steered to, my father was a colonel in the Army, was probably the premier Black neighborhood in the city of Greensboro, Benbow Park. I think there were 2 houses available in Benbow Park. And maybe looking around in some other places, and my parents thought those houses were above market value. And actually they were. And the realtor took my parents out to a place known as Woodmere Park off of Phillips Avenue. And my parents saw a house comparable to some of the ones they had seen in Benbow Park, and actually priced a little less. And they purchased their first home. My father left to go to Vietnam. We went back to Mount Gilead to finish school. And then months later, we moved into our house in Woodmere Park. Since my father was career military, my only exposure to segregation had been when I was 10 years old, when we moved to Greensboro for 1 year when he went to fight the Korean War. And I don't think that was, maybe that was a consideration to my parents. Maybe they knew something about Woodmere Park. I'm not sure they knew that we were going to be the first Black family to move into Woodmere Park. I'm not sure they were clear on that. However, you know, under the circumstances, that's where they purchased. And then within weeks, there were for sale signs up on our street. Within months, all of the people on our street had moved. There was white flight. There were some folks that would come to my mother and say, we don't want to move. We hate that we have to move, but we can't be the last one on the street. And so subsequently, the whole neighborhood turned over. Woodmere Park probably has about 300 homes. And so there was a newspaper article done and some different things, and we found out that maybe we were part of what was called blockbusting. And that's where it's basically realtors take advantage of white fear and white flight and help them facilitate selling their houses to Black folks first. Our family realtor that we had, I know him for a long time now. I'm not sure if he's still alive. I wouldn't call him a blockbuster though. I would call him a good businessman that was seeking markets for pent-up demand. And Woodmere Park happened to be that market, and it showed that there was a pent-up demand for middle-class housing for Black people. Next to Woodmere Park was another housing development called Kings Forest. And some of the folks moved from, some of the white people moved from Woodmere Park to Kings Forest, only to find out that when Woodmere Park was sold out to Black folks, that then the next area was Kings Forest within a 3-year period or so. Also, what happened within that period of time, maybe after the neighborhood in Woodmere Park turned all Black, there were maybe four or five entrances into Woodmere Park off of Phillips Avenue. There was a great open space and things in Phillips Avenue, and then the powers that be decided that open space should be public housing, and therefore we have Claremont Homes. And then a decade or so, there had been a thriving Winn-Dixie there at the corner of Phillips Avenue and one of the entrances to Woodmere Park. And Winn-Dixie decided that I guess it was no longer profitable for them to be in that spot for whatever reason. They vacated the spot, and it stayed vacated for 3 decades. Basically, and still there is no grocery store there today. So that was my experience with blockbusting in Greensboro.
Chuck, we want to thank you for sharing your personal experiences and really helping us all to really see the reality of blockbusting and what can happen with that. Our next panelist is Sue Schwartz. Sue Schwartz has served as the director of the City of Greensboro's Planning Department since 2013. Prior to taking over the department, Sue had extensive career experience that allowed her to serve and provide leadership for national professional organizations in her field. Sue Schwartz, as a city planner here in Greensboro, when you look at Greensboro today, what do you see that can easily be tied to redlining practices from decades ago?
Thank you, Stan. You know, there was a few years ago, I say more than a few, if they kind of pile up, we were looking at, when somebody wanted, there was one of the call was to do a neighborhood indicators project. And so we were looking, our staff was looking at different things. What do you measure about neighborhood health? And I will never forget it just playing out. Maybe other people knew it all along, but for us, it was just kind of gobsmacked. So Jeff Sovich in our office was in charge of mapping all these things. So we mapped age of houses, and we mapped conditions, and then housing conditions. And we mapped crime, and we mapped arson. And we started lining the maps up along the hallway on the partitions and realized that the same crescent kept showing up. And it starts up in Northeast Greensboro, and it kind of swoops down across the city and comes all the way across. And all these things come together. And you start looking at it, and the development time was about the same, what happened. And then you start looking at the redlining maps, and it's like, well, these conditions evolve over time and perpetuate each other based on from those practices. And it's very hard to break that pattern. So that's a big one, just being able to map it. But when you go through communities, you can see the difference of care. I'm gonna show if you can see this. This is my new eye opener, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And I had read bits and pieces of it before, but our department, our leadership team read it together as a group this summer and had a book. It was facilitated by the library. We had our own book club, if you will. And I went to planning school. My master's degree is in geography. I've worked at things at the national level with our professional association. I know the clinical definition of redlining. You know, I just thought, well, I'll be honest, for as little as it gets in the literature, I thought it was some really bad realtors across the country that had done this. And then I read this and start seeing and talking about all these things that reinforced and perpetuated it. And one of the things you see in Greensboro is the differences in the care of the neighborhoods. You see the ones that were dealt with, built during the redlining, they got less money to be built. So there wasn't money for open space. There wasn't money for landscaping. There wasn't money for trees. And then you swoop over and you look over in the Northeast, and there's a discernible difference. Now, no one's done the study like they did in Richmond. It came out, I want to say, and Stephen, maybe you know about this. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And the question was, why are poor neighborhoods hotter than other neighborhoods? And it traces back to redlining, because in redlining, they wouldn't get money for landscaping when they built neighborhoods. They didn't get money to preserve open space. So over time, those neighborhoods we all love because they have the big, rich tree canopies, they don't have those in those neighborhoods that didn't have a sufficient funding to be developed to the same care and character as others. So you can still see that. Sorry, I'm doing this from home. I have a dog that had decided that she needed to be a star. I'm back now. But those are the physical things you can see. But I would say I've been with the city for 33 years. And I really think Greensboro is an exceptional place, and we have a lot to be proud of. But one of the things that, since you've become aware in reading this book and then looking at the redlining maps, part of it is attitudinal. It's how people view other parts of Greensboro. And I think a lot of that stems of how they were developed and how they were treated over time through the redlining process. So I think, and that persists. There's a difference. We talk about East Greensboro, but we don't talk about West Greensboro. We designate it as an other place and not us. So I think there's physical impacts, there's historical impacts, and there's attitudinal impacts that you can still feel its legacy here in Greensboro from redlining. And I got a nod from a professor, so I feel so much better now. It's like he didn't mark up my paper, but.
Thank you, Sue, for giving a planner's perspective and really helping us see the effects of redlining. Also, too, Color of Law is definitely a must-read.
Mm-hmm.
Our next panelist, Wilson Lester, is the Executive Director of Piedmont Business Capital. His work focuses on reducing barriers to capital for communities historically marginalized by systemic bias in the lending industry. Wilson, you work with a number of minority and women-owned businesses in our area. Can you talk about what generational wealth means for the African-American community and how it can be tied to redlining?
Stan, thank you for the question. Morgan and team, appreciate the platform, and very privileged to be with Stephen, Sue, and of course, Chuck Byrd. I appreciate Sue for pointing out The Color of Law. And if you're not familiar with the book, I recommend you Googling a short 17-minute video called Segregated by Design, which Piedmont Business Capital showed at our annual conference in 2019 to really have a conversation about how wealth has escaped the Black family, not by anything but laws that were designed to stymie the escalation of Black independence, Black wealth creation, Black economic ecosystems. That's really what it did, and that's really what the truth is. There was a moment where the African-American community in the United States of America was burgeoning on the edge of really being an economic force independent of any other ecosystems by force, forced to do business with each other, forced to have these enclaves because of race and bias. And what we have here now in 2021, even still, are people that have significant disparities in income and significant disparities in generational assets. The homes that are in East Greensboro that were developed, more than likely were developed by the same developers that built homes in other parts of Greensboro. And that house may be worth $70,000 today in East Greensboro, but is worth $368 off of Benjamin Parkway. Same builder, same wood, same nails, same time period, but originally purchased or developed for a different community. And that is a hard thing to rationalize as an adult when you see something that your parent worked for, or in Chuck's case, his parents worked hard. His father went to war twice to try to provide a life for his family. And somebody else's father did the same thing during the same generation. But when they left the home behind, that person was able to utilize it for something that could scale their opportunities because they had an asset that was had significant worth and or could send them to college or could allow them to start a business. And that's just not the same thing for the African American in our community today. We see it as an organization when we are making loans. We really saw it in 2020 because we began to make loans to a number of different people because a lot of people's businesses were hurting. But apples to apples, we saw a disparity in those that had access to sufficient collateral for some loans in some cases, because they didn't have those tangible things that they were able to reinvest. You know, when we look at I'm sorry I talk slow because I'm thinking about what I'm going to say, but when we look at it from generation to generation, we have an opportunity to address the need for parity due to these populations not having access to the same resources. Sue mentioned the care of community. There have been plenty of times when you go through a neighborhood and you just wonder, you know, why they're not as clean or they're not as taken care of as other parts of town. That may not be current today, but it's current historically. And the document that Sue shared will explain how those communities were not invested in to create a notion of the type of people that live there that validated risk assumptions. I could go on and on, Stan, but I won't.
Thank you, Wilson. We really appreciate that, helping us understand the economic perspective, whether it's income disparities, disparities in terms of property values, and also talking about generational wealth. So we've got a few more questions, and these questions are for all of our panelists. The first one, when you hear what Wilson just talked about, what connections do you make with redlining and its legacies? I'm going to start with Stephen.
I think that denial of capital to the Black community in what was a thriving economic community, as Wilson pointed out, by necessity, by force, is a huge part of what redlining did. But it wasn't the only thing. We have labor standard laws in the late 1930s that were meant to protect workers that denied African-American workers by exclusion from minimum wage and 40-hour work weeks, from child labor. We had the GI Bill. 1.8 million African-American GIs came back from wars overseas and weren't able to get loans that white GIs did. This helped the working class become the middle class in white communities, but left out those in Black communities. So that denial of capital really is an issue that has had a lasting effect on businesses, on educational attainment, on health, et cetera.
Thank you. Chuck, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I was trying to type in the chat to answer a question, and I sent it back to all panelists. And so the question is why are Black homes why do they decline and they're so devalued? My wife hates for me to say this. We have, by choice, owned homes only in Black neighborhoods, other than some investment property, but homes that we've lived in. We've lived in 4 homes. Well, one before I was married. She and I have lived in 3 homes, all in Black neighborhoods in the city and the county. And I say that by my selling those homes, or even the ones that I still have my parents' home in Woodmere Park. If I were to sell it, that we have realized at least $500,000 less equity than if those same homes had been in another location. At minimum, that's $500,000 that I don't have to pass on as an inheritance. So the answer to the question as to why do they decline, when whites will not move into Black neighborhoods, that takes away a great percentage of your market. So if whites will not move into Black neighborhoods, but will only purchase investment property, which helps turn something that had been home ownership to now increases the rate of rental property in that area versus home ownership, or unless a neighborhood is identified for gentrification, then whites will buy property from Blacks. So I was doing that while you asked the question, so I don't know the current question. I'm sorry.
Well done, Chuck. Thank you. Sue, you have anything you want to add to that question?
How do I top both of those guys? I mean, I'll take the another question for 200 there, Stan.
All right, well, let's give you another question. So can you tie gentrification back to redlining, and is gentrification an issue in Greensboro?
Well, this is the subject of some debate, so I will, I see Stephen already nodding. So in the true clinical sense of redlining, where there is a flip and a change from lower income communities being bought up and flipped over into higher income communities by new investors, there's at least, and if there are more examples, I'm open to hearing about them, but that's not Greensboro's history. We have issues of displacement and people being, especially because we don't have enough housing stock for all different price points. So that creates all sorts of crunchiness. But it's, you know, having, and I guess my view is a little stilted, because when I first learned about sort of gentrification on a massive scale, I was in Chicago at a conference, and they were basically, literally, you could tell the difference between this, you know, sort of Victorian craftsman style neighborhood that had been a working class neighborhood, and then you just see it going into, you know, your best Pottery Barn, you know, recombined kind of thing. You could just see that people were being shut out, and African-American businesses were being shut out. We're moving on. So there is, in terms of the true clinical definition, maybe not so much, but that doesn't mean we don't have issues with displacement, issues with understanding values. In my time here, one of my more frustrating understandings is, why is it home values don't appreciate? If part of how we build wealth is we buy this house, or we help our kids buy their house, and over time it appreciates, and you have some equity that you can use to send the grandkids to college or whatever. But that attenuation, that ability to build wealth, is so flattened. It's just not, it's not the same. Buying it even in, you know, Glenwood is different than buying it in Old Ashboro. I mean, it's just, you don't get the same value for your home investment that would be normal, I guess, normal in air quotes. So we might not have like the big academic definition of gentrification, but we do have issues that are related to how the original investment of the community, and then over time, how it was reinvested or moved on in its history, that we are currently challenged with.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So Stan, I think I have an anecdotal example out of my experience, but since the professor was shaking his head yes, also I'd like to hear from him first, his thoughts about gentrification in Greensboro.
Jump in, Stephen.
Yeah, so looking at the three different models of gentrification, and they do take into consideration different factors like educational attainment, income, wealth, and a change over a 20-year period. Think, for example, where Morningside Homes was, and today we have Willow Oaks. That entire block group changed in income and educational attainment dramatically in a short period of time. And it stands out on one of the models as gentrification. We're seeing the same thing occur with studentification in the north side of Glenwood, where houses that were owner occupied or renter, but moderate to low income are now student housing. And that whole segment has changed. Finally, in the mill area of the new mill project on the north end of town, we see a sudden shift in incomes, but it's not quite the same as the displacement that we see in other places. It's new housing and new people coming into those that hasn't yet offset others in the area.
Thank you. Wilson.
Yeah, so, oh, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
My perspective on it is more of it's a matter of time. As the city grows and more reinvestment happens in certain corridors where people want to be, and where there are organizations actively promoting and investing in the interest of people and the attraction of people to those areas, we are going to see it. And to Chuck's point about having an anecdotal perspective, you know, I moved to Greensboro from Atlanta, Georgia, and I lived in a neighborhood called Grant Park. It was just off of downtown near the Atlanta Zoo. Our house when we left was priced at $190. Sold it to somebody that sold it to a flipper. A couple years later, that house sold for $500,000. And when we left, when we put that sign in the yard, I literally had neighbors saying, please don't leave, knowing that, you know, what was coming. We have seen, I think, for someone that's seen it happen, I've seen enough to say that, you know, it's on the way. I think what we can do about it, though, is making sure that the communities that are there have a chance to participate in the value creation of the community. We make sure that there are opportunities for African-American owned and minority owned businesses to thrive in those communities and have access to development projects in those communities, so that the wealth that comes to market doesn't escape the market. Can I say that? But, you know, tying gentrification to redlining, people gentrify where they can get a good deal. All right. And the good deals are in East Greensboro. I don't think anybody's arguing that. The opportunity to buy something cheap and sell it high is where property values are lower. That's where people gentrify. I think it's something that we have to tackle as a community. I think it's something that we have to understand is a real opportunity. We see it happening in the communities that surround us. We see it happening in Raleigh. We see it happening in Charlotte. Above the Fold last year in the Charlotte newspaper last May, you know, they were talking about the commercial displacement of Black businesses in these redevelopment areas. And I think it would be challenging for us to think that it's not a possibility here locally. To some extent, we see it happening in our neighboring communities right here in the Triad. And we need to figure out a way to stay ahead of the curve and be certain that people that live in the communities, A, are not displaced, and B, have an opportunity to participate in the new value that has come to the market and not just selling their property at a low price for someone else to develop and experience the wealth gain from.
Excuse me,
Thank
if
you,
you
Wilson.
saw in the paper today, perfect timing, Greensboro paper, say it was about third page in, it was about a neighborhood in Charlotte that's just, they're fighting gentrification. I mean, big, they're next to NODA. And so there is an African-American neighborhood. Stan, you may know that neighborhood. That was in the paper this morning. That it's,
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the name. It'll keep
it's like
talking.
Howie something. But it was the frustration and just reading about the discussions with the existing neighbors. I've said, you know, so we have neighborhoods that they're in the condition they're in because they lack investment. You know, but in order to improve them, we need to increase investment, which then changes value, which then can create this. So if we can ever whoever figures this out gets the Nobel Peace Prize, because it's kind of a weird conundrum. I'm not being glib. It's just, there's the basic paradox to start with it. And being aware, being sensitive, being part of how do you create wealth, as Wilson pointed out. And Chuck has been waiting to speak, and I am sorry, I jumped in front of you, Chuck. I'll just be quiet now and bow to the man who lived it.
Go ahead, jump in, Chuck.
Yeah, well, and like I said, this is going to be anecdotal to some extent because, you know, sometimes when you miss a detail, that can color things differently. But I'm going to give an example of where I think gentrification has happened in our city. And earlier, Stephen had mentioned Garl Street. And I can't remember the year, but there were some bonds passed for housing in South Side, what they called South Side, Greensboro, which is that area that overlooks the train station into downtown where Ashboro Street, now Martin Luther King, intersected with Garl Street. And that area was basically dilapidated or vacant, etc. Those bonds sat for more than 10 years before they were utilized. And when they were utilized, Milton Kern, a downtown developer, built some nice apartments, all brick, overlooking. And then Garl Street right there, houses start being bought up after the beautiful brick retail structure where Dame's Waffles, chicken and waffles, the beautiful brick condos where you could have retail on the bottom and things like this. And these were selling for a couple of $100,000 plus. And then Garl Street started being bought up. And if you look at that neighborhood now, I haven't really looked at the demographics. Beautiful neighborhood. I would call it gentrification. And there are more white people living there than there are Black people.
And it's really interesting, Chuck, because what's always so interesting about that dynamic is right in front of your face. Where is that investment on the other side of the bridge of Morrow Boulevard? Where is that investment on the other side of the bridge of Gate City Boulevard? It's not the same. And it's almost, that's why I say it's coming, it's imminent, it's going to happen. It's just, when do people place their investments?
So I can provide a little context because I was the project manager for Southside. You set me up, Chuck. I still love you.
I said I may have missed a detail.
Well, there's some big things, you know, at that time, in the late 80s and the early 90s, there had been several redevelopment bonds. The city had not used redevelopment bonds in several years. And so the Best Street area, the Garl Street, I guess Best Street is now Benjamin Benson. Do you remember the Best Street grocery store down there, Chuck? It was like, It was the best drug corner between Atlanta and DC. Was right there tucked into Greensboro. So there were several redevelopment bonds that were put together, and that was assigned South Side. And I will tell you that it was a lot different than most other projects we had, because there were an inventory of historic homes, structures. We still had some, the big Victorian the twos that sit there on Goral Street, and there were some in the interior on McAdoo and Murray. And it was a collection of different housing types, which was unusual. This was the early 90s. And oh my gosh, you're going to put townhouses and apartments and homes together? You're crazy. And everybody wants a grocery store, and the economics weren't working. At the end of the day, and not to not to get defensive, to me, it was interesting as we worked on that project, and there was $5 million. It was the same year, it was in the same bond package that the Coliseum finally passed, if that puts a time frame. And as we worked through the project, we worked through all the different, with the neighborhood leaders, Nettie Code, Dorothy Brown from Old Ashboro, Betty Cohn from Old Greensboro. It was a really interesting group of people. The part that to me was just disheartening, as we started buying properties, we had a couple of notorious property owners that torched the houses rather than sell them to the city. Thank you, that was helpful. But we would hear comments, "You're nuts. The city's wasting its money. Why should the city recreate this neighborhood?" And that's what the redevelopment plan was. There was the idea, here's our chance, one chance to recreate this turn of the 19th, 20th century neighborhood adjacent to downtown, and possibly demonstrate that people could still live downtown. Because also in the early 90s, that was a crazy notion. You people are nuts. This isn't going to happen. You're goofy planners. You're thinking crazy. I never thought. I thought we had a solid plan. I thought we had figured out ways that we could fund the restoration of some of those houses and attract new investment. But in hindsight, total hindsight, we thought we had such a tough sell to get any kind of development over there. We just look, we'll get market rate. And we thought market rate was gonna be not what it turned out to be. And so in hindsight, we did not put any affordable housing issue or requirements in any of the development, because we didn't think we'd even get anybody to bite on the project. And in hindsight, and then who knew, one, we got a really good design, two, we got a developer out of Charlotte who saw the potential, and then it's more dense than anything that we ever imagined. My lessons learned from this, Chuck, is one, we had market studies done, we had other things. We were convinced that if we could just get somebody to put something out there just to get it to the base level of market, we would be okay. We were gonna change the floor. A couple things happened, beautiful architecture, and at that time in the early 2000s, interest rates dropped below 5% or 6%. And all of a sudden, and oh, by the way, us boomers had a lot of money to give to our millennial children so they could have $10,000 to put because we were still making money at the time until the Great Recession. All those factors came to play. What is my lesson learned? What was the other thing? So here's the other thing that you mentioned, across the street, Wilson, across the street. It was believed that because we had demonstrated the market, that someone would want to continue that kind of development and create better investment in Old Ashboro. And you see a beautiful park, but not new housing, and that didn't happen. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned. We have cool neighbor. As for the mixture of the neighborhood, I used to know it like the back of my hand, Chuck, but now there's so many units over there. And by the way, Milton Kern didn't, that he didn't get any bond money for that, which is also a weird thing that flipped, is no one believed that anyone would buy up industrial land and put multifamily housing next to a train track. Who does that? But at the end of the day, there's within Southside proper, it is a very interesting collection. I don't know the exact demographic numbers. I never thought there would be children there. I always thought this was a young folk or a retirement place, because who would want their kids to live there? They have, the fire department has a big event for them, and it's really a cross section from all parts of the universe, lifestyle, ethnic background, etc. All this to say, the lessons of what do we do with this? Okay, this is our gentrification corner, and we, the city, did it. Not what we meant to, but we did it. So what do we learn from it? Design is important. I have a council member who will bend my ear about how she wants to make sure that what we put out there for housing looks good, people want to be in good neighborhoods. That it's also about creating value. That was my big aha, is that it's not just about putting units on the ground, it's about creating value in the community. And that value takes a lot of different forms. Value of the structures, value of the civic engagement, value of, that this is a place we want to be. And we can't just focus on any one thing. All these things have to come together if we're going to be successful in helping areas revitalize and thrive. So.
Now I've got two questions that I absolutely have to get in.
Oh no, and I'm sorry, Stan,
That's okay.
I was on my soapbox.
I'm enjoying the dialogue. This question, I'm gonna start with Stephen because he touched on it a little bit in his presentation. And that question is, how did redlining affect access to quality education, healthy food, and healthcare?
Yeah, and I've seen there's several questions in the chat that kind of go along those same things. School, catchment areas for elementary schools matter. If you have a community where less than 10% of the population has above a high school education, and they're sending their kids to the same school, and their poverty rate is 50 or 60%, that PTSA is going to be choked for resources. The after school programs that have tutoring, that have parents that come in and do things, aren't going to be there because the parents are working and don't have the resources to put into it. Elementary schools matter. We have one school district now. Back in the day, it was still 3 school systems, and those tax money went in different directions. 2, the neighborhoods that were redlined and around them are medically underserved neighborhoods today. Primary care, the Blunt system, the Blunt medical system at the very south end of MLK at the highway, and Mustard Seed are the 2 primary care providers in Southeast Greensboro. There's now one cone facility where RCC was in the northeast side of town, out towards Woodmere Park. There just aren't primary medical care providers, so people end up at the emergency department instead of in primary care. No vision clinics, very few dental offices. So all of those things that folks need. And then we get into food deserts. I'm glad that there's now a Family Dollar on MLK, but that is not a supermarket. It might qualify under USDA as a supermarket, but it's not. So we need more access to medical, dental, vision, good schools at the primary level, after school programs, and food resources.
Thanks, Stephen. Anybody else want to jump in on that question? Okay, here's another question. So what would you say to people who feel like this is no longer an issue?
Well, I would like to jump in a little bit to make a comment.
Sure.
As Stephen had talked about 3 ways gentrification happens, and I'm beginning to feel like a fossil here because I was around for a lot of this and participatory in much of it. And I was on the Coliseum Commission that helped bring the bond in for Southside and the Coliseum. I also worked with the Morningside Homes Neighborhood Association. And what I would say about that gentrification is it's a beautiful neighborhood, but there were 400 people living in subsidized housing in Morningside Homes, and there weren't 20 that were able to move back in. And those other 380 were scattered to the winds. So, you know, these words, just like I don't like the word blockbusting for business folks who were taking advantage of market opportunities for when presented to the Black community. The word gentrification is nice and easy. I think displacement is a word that's being used more. How do we handle when people are being displaced, or where we're creating neighborhoods in which people who resided there are no longer able to reside there? And so that's just the part I'd like to throw in.
All right, well, thank you. We have another part to this session. And so with that, I want to thank all of you for sharing your insight, your expertise, and your experiences. So now let's give our attention to Morgan as we go into the last part of our discussion. Thank you all.
This has been amazing. So many great questions. I don't think we have a hope of getting to them all because it's wonderful to see the critical thinking happening here in our community around this. So I'm going to do my best to get to as many of these questions as possibly we can. So I might try and combine a few. So I do see some questions here about what can we do, right? So what kind of reparations might help reverse these effects? One question was specifically to Wilson. You know, you said gentrification is imminent, and I agree. What ideas have you seen that work to build wealth for families without gentrifying? So let's talk about some of the solutions or some of the things you all have seen to help create a more equitable community.
I have ideas. I have ideas. I don't know if I've seen one specific solution, but you know, I think I can't remember, but I'm sure that I think I had talked to Sue about this at one point in time, and we were just talking about projects that were coming to the city, and if there was going to be redevelopment in some of these communities, are there opportunities for curb appeal to be invested in for residents that live in these communities that can help their home increase in value and look just as nice as a home that is coming into the community, whether that be landscaping or new fresh coats of paint, you know, some new fixtures, stuff like that to the exterior of the home at a minimum. If opportunities like that are available, I think what is also important is to take a look at you know, what assets are owned in the community, and especially if they're owned by public partners, if there can be incentives to encourage folks that are in and of those communities to either participate on development on those vacant opportunities, those lots, be an investor versus just a seller. You know, I think that there should be some education about that to residents. You know, maybe there's a position where a resident that maybe really does want to take advantage of the escalation in value of the community, and they do own an asset in the community that somebody wants to redevelop versus selling it for cash now. Why not be an equity partner in redevelopment so that more cash is coming into that vein? I think that there are ways that we can get creative about it to make it meaningful for individuals. But to point to a specific example that I've seen, I have yet to see that. Other panelists may have seen other things that they may be interested in sharing.
I think that Sue rightly and courageously shared some of the dilemma that we face in trying to solve these intractable problems where there are systems, be they government, be they banking, be they private development. There are systems in place that are market driven, and whether they think that there are racist elements in that, or there's just a right to make the most profit when you take the risk. And then all of us in different ways become complicit in that. It's difficult. And we need to work together with intent around these issues, but also recognizing what we can learn from what happened in the past. If we're going to build a beautiful Morningside neighborhood, don't we have the responsibility to those 380 people that we displaced that'll never come back to make sure they have something at least equal or better than they left? You know, where's the connection to that? If we're going to subsidize developers or subsidize projects, don't we have a responsibility to make some demands upon those developers to have some social capital and responsibility as part of this development in return for helping them get a greater return on investment that then equals market value? We just have to have these conversations and in good faith, you know, try to work it out.
Stephen.
Yeah, if I can, I'm going to throw something here in the chat as well, a link to one of the issues that's still ongoing in East Greensboro, and that is the environmental issues that we've created. There's a landfill that's underneath a park in East Greensboro. It has hazardous metal and volatile organic compounds in it. The city's been struggling for 11 years now, starting with an EPA brownfields grant, to get it addressed. And NCDQ is working on its third, fourth, fifth study to address the park. They have not communicated, though, with the residents of the neighborhood. This is not the first landfill in East Greensboro. White Street, as you'll remember, a glass smelter in East Greensboro. All of these were issues that were planned intentionally to be in Black communities, industrial areas, sewage processing plants. And these issues have to be not just beautified, not just covered over with a park, but addressed fully so that we have healthy land to rebuild what were thriving mixed use, mixed income communities. These were communities planned out of existence and dumped into, and it's much more than just building some new houses for communities. We have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. So I know we have several teachers who are on this webinar. So I thought this was a really interesting question. So many great resources have been shared out in the chat. I encourage everyone to check those out. But this person asked, how can I engage my students? And maybe widen that out. How can we engage family members, other people we love and care about? How can we engage them with discussions about redlining in Greensboro or overall?
I'll jump a little. So the American Planning Association has curriculum, and so volunteer planners can go into schools or into schools virtually to just even talk about what this is. And so so there's some resources that way. And I'm sure there are other professional associations out there that have those resources, or we could all just download Dr. Sills' stuff because he has like thebomb.com on the resources. But asking kids, I mean, I find it when I've been asked to come into schools, or when we have engaged in kids in the neighborhood, in a planning effort, you know, they have the most amazing insights from their scale, from teenagers who have a completely different view to little kids who will tell you, you know, where the scary places are but what's really cool about their neighborhood. But then I love the conversations with them about not just what's great about your neighborhood, how do we make it better? How do we make it better for, you know, for in next year and next year? And there's a lot of tools. So I don't have those on my at my brain at the moment, but I'll put them together, and I'm sure we'll have some follow-up to get so folks can dive into those.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. All right. This question, I guess this might be more for Wilson, but anyone can of course jump into it. The banking industry is certainly responsible and should be creating solutions to help reverse the results and bring about systemic change. Wilson, can you give us some insight into how the banking industry is tackling this issue?
Yeah, great. And I will echo friend and colleague Juan Austin's comment in the chat, is that banks are responsible. And a few of the ways that they do that is through the Community Reinvestment Act. It requires them to make significant investments in communities where they operate and have a footprint. We see pledges a lot of times and are looking for activity. I know Chuck will probably comment in a minute when I get done about the truest commitment to CRA investment. But, you know, we also see it happening at the local foundational level. That every bank, for the most part, has a community foundation where those organizations make direct investments in entities that are on the ground doing the work in those communities. I can attest that Piedmont Business Capital has been a beneficiary of those resources to address things like financial literacy and access to capital for people that are looking to grow businesses and thrive in these communities. We are a community development financial institution, which is a designation by the Department of Treasury. So oftentimes we have relationships with banking institutions that offer us debt capital at a subprime rate so that we can extend capital into the community, because we understand the touch points on those businesses and those folks living there, and understand how to lend to them and recover the debt successfully without harm to the borrower and without harm to the organization. But I believe that folks are getting it. And I think over the last year, we saw that more than ever because there's a lot of data that we're pointing to right now. And I made a comment in another conversation earlier this morning, is that, you know, our communities have to own their data. We have to own our data. And we can't communicate our story without it. But the better we understand that information, the more we can leverage our opportunities with large banks that have a physical presence in our market to do more and create more resolve around the issues that ultimately were created by practices that they experienced huge capital gains from over the years and continue to.
Thank you, Wilson. Anyone else want to jump in on that question before we get ready to close? All right. Well, thank you also. Oh, go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, I'm just going to say Wilson's done an excellent job around CRA. If there were to be equity in this community, Piedmont Business Capital would, within the next month, receive tens of millions of dollars to continue doing what it's doing in its CDFI. We still have a lot of learning to do. We still have a lot of growth to do. But when we look at, again, the amalgamation of these systems that have to work together to move capital, banking, real estate, appraisers, insurance companies, governments, when we look at these systems and we know that in a capitalistic society that money and profit, and we say markets, are the prime driver. However, I don't know the statistics in Greensboro, but they're virtually the same all over the nation. In Winston-Salem, there is a need right now for 16,000, what we would say are affordable homes. That's a tremendous market. How come our banks and real estate developers and construction industry and all of these folks who have to gain by this development happening, how come we can't figure that out? It flies in the face of what we say capitalism is, where we see a demand and we provide a supply. And I'm afraid, and I don't want to end on a depressing note, because hope, is what keeps me going. But I'm afraid too much of this is by design, that it's not happening. And those of us of goodwill are going to have to call it out where we see it. And keep, as Wilson say, keep the data flowing, keep and keep it in front of our face, and build on a base of truth, as opposed to a base that justifies actions because they're profitable.
Thank you for that call to action, Chuck. I think that is certainly a good place to end this fabulous discussion. I hope all of our panelists are seeing all the accolades for this discussion happening in the chat. For everyone involved, do be aware that the recording, you should get an email with the recording since you registered, because I know I'm going to have to watch this a couple of times just to soak in all this fabulous information. So Sue, Stephen, Wilson, Stan, Chuck, my goodness, thank you all so much for your time this evening. This has been such a powerful conversation, and I know so informative. So in closing, I want to turn things over to my good friend, Glenn Perkins from the Greensboro History Museum to take us out. Go ahead, Glenn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Morgan. And thank you so much to all of our fantastic panelists. If anybody comes to you and says, what does history matter for our community? I suggest maybe you point them to this program, because we see how much those historical decisions that people made affect the way that we live today, the food that we eat, the access we have to healthcare and education, and all those things. I was inspired by Mr. Byrd's conclusion there about building on a base of trust. And I like to think that examining our history and being able to hold it up is something we can do to build that base of trust. I do want to, I was very excited when my wonderful colleagues Morgan and Beth suggested this program, and I hopped right on, in part because I'm working, our museum is working with the Department of Communication Studies at UNC Greensboro right now for a very engaging program of democracy tables, part of our Project Democracy 2020 initiative at the museum. We have some of those starting right now in February, starting talking about police, community, and justice, but in March, we will also be talking about housing and equity. And it's going to be a great opportunity to take a lot of the facts that we've learned tonight and to have the chance to have conversations with neighbors about these issues and learn more about people's experiences about how these issues are affecting them in their daily lives. I'll put that information in the chat, and I hope you will come and be part of those democracy tables conversations. Invite your friends to take part. Again, it's been just an amazing opportunity to learn from these wonderful experts here on our panel. Please let us know if you like this program, if you want more of this kind of program. We will be happy to respond, bring some things back, go deeper into details. But again, let me thank Morgan and Beth, and let me thank all of our wonderful panelists for taking the time to be with us tonight. I wish everyone a wonderful night, and we will hope to see you again soon.